I see lots of new people to CV2 getting super confused with the inputs and outputs in chips. I don't want you to worry. I had a difficult time with it, and lots of other CV2 people had a difficult time with it when they first started. But as soon as you get a sense for how the inputs and outputs work, you'll know basically how to work all the chips and figure everything else out with CV2 and get your career started. Let's get right into it. Okay, so when people first see pistons in CV2, they're most likely gonna say that they want to go back to CV1 because of how confusing the inputs and outputs are. You cannot get your wiring tool out and hover over it and see what each input does, unlike CV1, where you can get out, say, piston, and hover over all the inputs, and it'll tell you what it does. For this, it does not happen. It will just show on the right or left of the input or output. So, starting off, the left side of any chip is an input. It's going in. You can imagine a wire or something going into the chip. It's going in, so input. The output is when the wire goes out, when it's outputting something. So, if I were to grab this is an output. It's gonna output to an input. So, it's outputting a signal and then inputting it into this piston. Something to mention is you cannot connect two wires of the same type, so you cannot connect an output with an output. You cannot connect an input with an input because it doesn't work. For a chip to work, it needs to have an output connected to the input, or the other way around. Alright, so here we have the button for CV2. Again, could look very confusing since this doesn't have an input side. That's because you can't necessarily input anything into a button. You press the button, it outputs a signal. You can't really... There wouldn't be a reason to have an input side in the first place. So, this is called a red execution. It's an output. Executions are red, which means when something is done, for this example, when the button is pressed, it's going to send out a signal. So it's kind of like if you turn a light switch on, that would send out a signal to the light to turn the light on. So if you wire that to that, now it's gonna output when the button is pressed, and it's gonna go to the input to make it so when the button is pressed, the piston is going to play. So if you see, I press the button, piston goes all the way up there. Here we have a different type of input and output. We have some gray here. If you hover over it, it will tell you what can go in the input or output. Like I said, CV2 is a little bit more complicated, and it won't tell you exactly what each input or output does. It just tells you, in this example, what can go into it. So it says an integer, a float, and a vector 3. That means that you can add an integer, a float, or a vector 3 together with another integer, float, or vector 3 and get the sum of that integer, float, or vector 3. So, something I should also mention is with almost any chip, if there's an input and an output side, you can connect those two together. So if I were to connect the sum back to the value, and then I were to get, say, let's get a variable chip. Integer variable. Integer variable is just a number like 1, 2, or 3, no decimal points. And we're just going to say we're going to connect that to that. So this is a green output, which means it's integer only. Something else I should mention is inputs are not cross-compatible. So if I were to connect green to blue, that would not work. What gray means, however, is that any input can go in there. So I could connect an integer, or if I wanted to, I can connect a float. Whatever, if you hover over it, It's just whatever it allows you to do. So an integer, float, or vector 3 in this case. But I cannot connect the integer and the float together. It does not work. So the outputs or the inputs have to be the same color for them to connect together, or relatively same color. As you can see, the green, these two greens connect together, yet they weren't the same color when they first started. Relatively the same color. The last type of general inputs or outputs is this yellow output right here. Usually yellow means an object or a player. In this case, it's an object. The object is the piston. So what this is going to do is it's specifically going to output information. So yellow, these little yellow things are information, and if they're, say, like blue when they're little, they don't have these little arrows at the end of them. They're just info. They're not going to send out a signal per se. They're just going to output information. So say I want to get the distance of this piston. It's going to output 0. It's not going to output a signal. It's just going to output 0 because that's the distance. Same with this. It's going to output a piston. So if I were to ask, like if I press the button and the button's going to tell me what device is running or something, I could wire this to something else using CV2, and that would tell me that this is a piston. It doesn't show an output or anything. It doesn't send a signal to an input. This just connects to anything that's not an arrow. So no reds, no... Actually, I think it's just a red. Reds are the only inputs and outputs that actually send signals, I believe. Don't take my word on that. CV2 can be pretty confusing when you first start out, but I assure you, as soon as you get the knowledge that you need, and trust me, it can be hard. As soon as you get that click in your head that tells you, oh, I get this now, you are good to go. You are ready to set everything up for your CV2 and practice, and become a master. If you want to watch other tutorial videos I've made, check them out, see what you can make, and I'd love to see it. If you want to message me on Rec Room, that's basically my only social, just Rec Room, just find me somewhere. Thank you for watching. I will see you guys in the next tutorial.